Carlton King, the former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in a jihadi organisation.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for free.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy podcast, the show which shines a light on the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations, but actually concentrates very much on geopolitics. You know, that world which sits around the secret world, and indeed everything else, business, etc., and functions either with you participating or without. So what we try and do on the show is explain how that world works so you can make the best for you and maybe also learn something. And we do this most often by bringing on great guests. And today is no exception. I've got Mr. Nazir Afzal on the show today. And why is he of import? Because he was a chief Crown Prosecutor of the United Kingdom in the northwest of England, which meant that he dealt with a hell of a lot of cases. But in addition to that, what is important is that he is of Pakistani heritage. So, Nazir, welcome to the show.
Hello, Carlton. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you very much, my friend. What I'll say ahead of everything is that you've got a new book out, haven't you? The Race to the Top.
Coming out in the middle of September. My first book was The Prosecutor, and that was just a memoir. And, well, it was just, I say, but it was a memoir. And it did really well. And this one is more of a polemic, more of a polemic, more of an investigative book where I've tried to understand. If you remember about a year ago, Carlton, we had a government report that said racism was history and basically it's being overrated and exaggerated. So what I wanted to do was to understand the experience of people of colour from the higher echelons of British society. So I've spoken to people you would know, leaders in health, business, politics, arts, culture, sport, etc., and ask them, is racism history? And guess what? Right now, despite being at the top of their profession, that's why the book's called The Race to the Top, they're still suffering. So I wanted to put some balance really on the current discourse, which is that somehow we're all, those of us who are talking about racism being a real issue, are somehow imagining it. Here's some real experiences. And so I've had the privilege really of speaking to them and sharing it with you and all your listeners in the next few weeks and months.
Fantastic. And I think that's a well-worthy project, because what I want to do is, within this show, is first of all, feel your temperature, get a feel of what it was like for you as a young chap growing up in the West Midlands, in the era when you did Solihull and all of that, and the Rivers of Blood speech, etc., etc. I think you're just about old enough to have heard that. Yeah. Because I know what it was like for me, because I'm born some several years earlier than you, and I was in an area which was, well, we were the only black people in the area. In fact, the only people of colour in the area, to be fair. So I had positives and negatives insofar as the people I call my grandparents were Lancastrians, didn't speak the Queen's English, only spoke the dialect, etc., etc. So I saw from two sides. I just wondered what your youth was like.
It was very real for us. My family came from Pakistan the year before I was born. It was the early 60s. Those of us who are old enough to remember, racism was extraordinarily overt. I was born in the shadow of Birmingham City football ground. I would never go out on a Saturday afternoon if I fancied living. The likelihood is that you'll be screamed at, shouted at, abused, spat at. In fact, they spat at you. If they spat at you, that was a result, because at least they beat you up. And I had that experience, as did my whole family, as did everybody around me. And it was only because we were different. I mean, there was no other reason for it. And of course, you had the National Front, you had skinheads, you had Enoch Powell up the road making these rivers of blood speech. People were, it's not a joke to think that my father and many others kept a suitcase packed just in case they wanted to chuck us out. And that's the example. The reality, of course, is that we had the most loving environment. Being at home was my safe place and my safe environment. But the moment you stepped out the door, you knew you were taking your life in your hands. And that's an existence. And people often say to me, you had a rite of passage. No, that was not a rite of passage. I did not want my children to go through that. I didn't want to go through it myself. It was something that we had to endure, experience. And of course, just like you, I imagine, it had an impact on you lifelong. And you realize, actually, being a victim, this is what it feels like, and therefore there shouldn't be others.
What do you mean by the people saying you had a rite of passage? Explain that to me.
They wanted to. That is part of growing up somehow. It's our price that we pay for coming to a new country, for example, that we should expect to be treated this way, and all of that, of course, is not true. It's only because of the color of my skin. It's only because of the background of my family. It's only because of being in an inner city environment that we were in that we were suffering these things. Nobody should have to go through this, but there was almost an expectation. If you, as you talk about policing, for example, back then, I was really good at running, and I had to run because I was being chased all the time. And the moment the police officer would see you back then, they would stop you. And think that maybe you'd carried out some shoplifting or something, rather than the young men, usually but white men, chasing after you down the street, And so you were always being targeted in one way or another. My existence was literally running from one event or one incident to another incident without necessarily getting the protection of the state, which, of course, we now expect, but back then certainly wasn't available.
Well, there's two things I want to pick up on there. First is that, yes, you came to the country as, and I'll sort of put inverted commas around that word, immigrant. Yes, by 1947, Pakistan, as part of British India, had become so-called free, although they, from day one, I don't know if you know, I had on the show Andrew Lowney, the chap who wrote about the Mountbattens and the #1 literary agent in the world. You will find out from his book on that the whole movement out of India was an absolute and total nightmare from point one to point two, that Britain played no role in securing that correctly and just wanted to run out before there was a problem. And of course, put in place levers it thought so it could control the subcontinent when they left.
The line they drew, which they drew, split the Kashmir, split the Punjab.
Correct.
And left a legacy of animosity and division.
Correct.
And they leave. This is how. I mean, not just talking about Britain, but organized. Countries, the imperial powers always want to leave a divided nation.
Well, it's divide and rule, isn't it?
Exactly that.
It's as simple as.
I think we my family went through partition, so 1 million people died. It's
Correct.
Ridiculous numbers. I mean. If we have a few thousand dying now, we think it's a catastrophe. But 1 million people died, because they had a few hours, certainly not months and years, to move from either Pakistan to India, depending on where their initial heritage was.
Or not, as the case may be, but finding that they were thrown out. That's the big difference, because a lot of people didn't want to move.
No, they didn't, and they were leaving everything behind. Can you imagine? I don't know. I live in Manchester now. Can you imagine being told, right, that's it, your house, your car, your family, your property, all of that doesn't belong to you anymore. Get out.
Yeah.
And do so by Wednesday. That's what was given to them. And so the extraordinary thing, though, is that my family did work. Initially they were caterers for the British Army, so they were doing. Providing tea and coffee, etc., to the army in India and Burma, for example. So despite that, there was a real sense of, love, I think, for Britain.
And that's what I wanted to touch on, you see, Nazir, when you were saying about immigrants. These are people who thought they were coming to the mother country on many occasions.
They were asked to. Were we told, we need you to do this work?
Correct. And of course, you weren't just coming, and this is what I always like to say, because I know Britain's very proud of its military prowess. These people weren't just coming after the Second World War. You know, these people, like my father, was in the Merchant Navy for the whole period of the war. I'm sure that your parents and family had something to do with fighting the colonial battle, if you will, against the Japanese for Britain, not for India, but as it was then, but for Britain. So people need to understand that. And that had gone for 400 years in the case of India, 400 years since Clive of India took over. And therefore, what people have to understand is you weren't coming here as some person who knew nothing about the country. You were coming here as some person who actually created the country, helped to create it.
You know, there's a lot of people talking about reparation now. I mean, I'm not educated enough to say that, but you know, India, trillions of pounds.
Trillions, literally.
You know, I mean, our GDP is about 2.something trillion. Trillions, maybe 30 trillions or something, were taken from that part of the world to feed Britain and build Britain. So, you know, the reality is, you know, we are brothers and sisters.
Correct.
And we were required, asked, begged to come. We came. We then did the most menial jobs for the most smallest salaries. All we did was focus on building our families, giving me and my siblings opportunities to educate ourselves. This was, in effect, us saying we want to better ourselves in the country that now is our home. And I've known no other home. I was born here. So,
and indeed, historically, if you wanted to look at it, had been your home. Every person of empire had an absolute right to live in Britain, and any other part of the empire.
Your passport said that you were under the protection of Her Majesty the Queen.
Correct.
So, or King, whichever.
King as it was then.
So you know, the reality is, you know, we're no different. We you know, people want to create this difference, but certainly we were of the same. And we were welcomed. We thought we were welcomed. My father, mother, and you know, my elder brothers thought they were welcomed, but the moment they arrived, then there were some people who just didn't welcome them at all.
Absolutely. And I just want to leave this part of the talk on one thing, and that is that in order to create the victory for Britain, for the United Kingdom in the Second World War, it is estimated that around about 3.5 million Indians died, many of them, in the famine, which actually the famine was orientated by Churchill, and Wavell said this, that actually we should be feeding our people. He said, no, the food's got to go back to the mother country. So 3.5 million people, many also fighting men. So 3.5 million die in India, British India, which includes Pakistan, etc. But in Britain, the losses were 500,000, to be precise, 450,000 people throughout the whole of the 6 years. So put that in context, and Britons need to understand that. Put that in context.
This is why, I mean, one of the reasons why we get so upset these days about not learning about our history.
Correct.
Because the only history is written by the winners, isn't it?
Correct.
And the only history you hear about is, you don't hear that Churchill was largely or partly responsible for the famine. You don't hear about the terrible massacres that took place, the way that people were treated, and the way they continue to be treated. But so you only hear about the very positives. I'm very strong on. We need to balance that. So
absolutely,
hear the good, and there's a lot of good. British Empire was the largest empire there's ever been in this world, and there's good to be said about that, but also you've got to balance it with all the negative things that happened, because they have left a legacy.
And economically, we should understand that what the empire was basically an enclosed market where everything fed back into Britain.
Yes.
So if you created rubbish cars India had to buy them. If you created poor trains, India had to buy them. And that goes for the rest of the empire, of course. That could be Africa, it could be Asia, it could be the Caribbean.
So bureaucracy, the British bureaucracy is, if you go to India and Pakistan now, if you want a document to be a legal document, it has to go 50 different people.
Absolutely.
The British created that for us.
Absolutely.
Because it created jobs, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've covered the wider geopolitics. Let's narrow it down now, because what I'm wondering is, did you have any local allies? Because what I said to you was, don't get me wrong, there wasn't no racism in my school, in my class. I can remember the first aspect, probably about day 3 in school, and some bloke calls me a Sambo, which I knew I'd be about 4, which I knew wasn't right. So we start to fight, and then I'm sent to the headmaster with the boy, because I'm the only black lad there, obviously. And the headmaster says, "What's the problem?" I said, "This guy called me a black Sambo." He said, "Well, you are black," and give me 6 of the best. And obviously give the lads 6 of the best. So, that was meant to be equality. So what I'm saying is, this is before anti-racism was in any way, shape or means even thought of. When we used to go to the bigger city or towns like Manchester, you'd see all the signs that used to say no blacks, no dogs, no Irish, and dogs and Irish were optional. So it was there all around you. And my old man taught us all how to fight, because one knew you had to defend yourself. Yeah. So it was all around you. But I had white allies. As I said to you, I had people who I call my grandparents, people I call my cousin, people I called whatever. Did you have such allies?
No, I didn't. I mean, I think it's
interesting.
Perhaps, I was born in very inner city Birmingham, and the people around me were also immigrants. I had one teacher who saw I was bright and supported me, but I think it was simply because, he was doing his job, to put it bluntly. But the only white person I knew was the doctor, the GP, my teacher. That's it. Anybody else. And as I said earlier on, you weren't really given any support from the authorities, the local police officer you were scared of, because also you realised that if you went to them and said, I've been beaten up, they'd say, yeah, okay, shrug their shoulders. And so I didn't have any white allies. And in fact, that didn't happen, I think, until my university days, 20 years ago. By that time, again, I was pretty much the only non-white face in my university, in my the law school, and then I began to find people who understood what it felt like to be the only one, and were much more supportive.
Interesting.
But just like you, though, the N word was used, the P word was used. Sambo came from Love Thy Neighbor. I was called Sammy Davis Jr. because the only black person they saw on TV, wasn't it? They said I smelled of curry. I didn't live in an Indian restaurant. I didn't smell of curry. They said, they would tell me to go back to my country, but they weren't even sure what country that was.
Exactly.
And even what continent. They'd call me a monkey and say, go back to Africa.
Africa, yeah.
I didn't have a Brummy accent, but, they would still mimic some Asian accent that they'd heard somewhere. It literally was relentless,
and it's painful. And let's not hide that, because we tend to wash over it, especially people from our era. But it's painful. Yeah. And it directs you along certain lines. And I know exactly what you're saying. And one of the things that I'm at pains to deal with is that, you see, I call race a nonsense, biological nonsense. Biologically, it's a nonsense. That's a fact. But it is the most absolute political reality. Yeah. And people who look like me have felt it, and people who look like you have felt it. For me, it's that basically throughout 3/4 of the world, you didn't, for about 300 years, don't get me wrong, blacks weren't always enslaved, but for about 300 years they were. And through 3/4 of the world, even the fact that you walked away from your bondage meant you were committing a criminal offence.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. So if you can imagine that, the fact that you say, do you know what, this man, woman is treated, and by the way, it's not a gender thing, man and woman treating you badly. It's people kind of let the women off on this. No. It's men and women were treating people badly, enslaved people, people of colour. And you know that from your perspective.
Yeah, I remember having a conversation with Theresa May when she was Home Secretary, and she said, Nazir, look, you're the Chief Prosecutor. How can there possibly be racism? What? And I said, look, have you got a few minutes? And I'm good credit to her, because she did say, okay, tell me. And I said to her, look, the fact is that there are no black chief constables. There are no black chief executives of National Health Trust. There are no black permanent secretaries in the civil service. You go through leadership position after leadership position, and you will find nobody that's black there. And those of us who do get to these higher ranks, we've had to fight on a daily basis against people trying to belittle us. Our failures are magnified. How many times, Carlton, were you sat in a room with another black person or an Asian person and people looked at you strangely? What are they up to?
More important, how have they got there?
Without being,
you've even though people knew your talents, the suggestion would be that you've only got there because of some type of quota.
Oh yeah, when I got my OBE, classic example. When I got my OBE in 2005, another chief prosecutor, a white one, much older than I, said to me, "You only got that because you're brown."
Yeah, there you go.
And the fact that I had pushed the service to do public engagement, which they had never done before, and that I had taken responsibility for casework that nobody else had done before, was irrelevant to him. It was simply the colour of my skin, and because he felt sense of entitlement. Which none of us have. We just fight for what we get. But he was expected, after how many years service, to have got his just for being there, all our failures are magnified. Every time you make a mistake, I can talk about my own experiences. Every time I made a mistake, there weren't many, thankfully, but you can rest assured what was that about, But whereas some... I can think of many white colleagues that made enormous mistakes and they were promoted.
It is absolutely the case, and I could go on forever for myself. But you see, what I will say is this: I've got this. Again, I'd like to know your perspective from it. I think we've simplified the process when we basically said the police are bad and nearly everybody else is good. So let me get stuff in context. So let's take one of the cases that is a watershed case, which was the case with the Lawrences. Now, you will know that within 10 days of that Lawrence case, the police had suspects, frankly, the actual suspects that were there, right? And the Crown Prosecution Service said, no, there's not enough evidence, right? You know that. That's 10 days, okay? Yeah. The police is the body that gets all the hits saying, oh, the police didn't do anything. They hid this, they hid that, they hid the other. How are they hiding everything when they've got the suspects, they've put them forward, but under the system we then had, which came about by that time, the police couldn't run the prosecution themselves. It had to go through the Crown prosecutors. And as you know, in that stage, it was 60-40, wasn't it? 60-40 chance of prosecution, sometimes even higher. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been taken to court, right? So then you get the perspective that the police somehow are hiding this, didn't want to do their job. How can that be the case? And then that's forgotten when everything's written about in years to come. So this is the thing. I think, and this is one thing I want to speak to you about a little bit later on, about the Crown Prosecution Service and how, frankly, it seems to sit itself in a position whereby it takes little of the criticism and a lot of the glory. But we'll come on to that. I'd like to see your perspective of how that works in terms of policing, because, obviously I'm trained in the CID. I will not, because every special branch officer had to be trained in investigative CID work, albeit this is in MPSB, Metropolitan Police Special Branch, Scotland Yard, albeit where I was from, albeit that we never did any criminal work at all. And the work where we really needed to use our criminal expertise for was basically in espionage. So if we arrested spies, that's when we were going to use it. And, funnily enough, in cases of race. So we actually dealt with cases of right-wing race when nobody else wanted to deal with them. Yeah. So the branch dealt with that.
I mean, the policing went on a journey, didn't it? Back in
massive journey
after Lawrence and the Macpherson report.
Before even.
Yeah, well, absolutely. But it was in a bad place. We all know it was in a bad place, and it had to change. And it decided, well, it had no choice really after Macpherson, to accept that there was institutional racism. What I'm concerned about, and I think many others are, is that we haven't made a lot of progress in 20-odd years. That actually, in fact, it's not just true policing. About every agency. Do you remember how many agencies immediately off said, "Oh, we're institutional racist too"? Yeah, we are.
No, I don't remember that. That's the point. I don't remember that. I don't remember them saying that.
Oh no, they're all saying it.
This is what I want to question you about. I'll give you an story, and then I want you to just question you about it. I was in the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6 at the time. Okay, so I was over there, and I remember them saying, "Oh, it's unbelievable how institutionally racist the police are. Unbelievable." And I turned around to my boss, then who was head of counter-terrorism section, and I said, obviously I'm not going to give any names, I said, listen, I am, in this organisation, as far as I know, the only black case officer. Indeed, the only case officer I've seen of colour, right? So and a case officer, for want of a better description, is the guy who does the James Bond work, the fellow who all operations run through. So you run all the operations worldwide, right? So it's a senior post, it's powerful, and you can depend on, if you need something from the military, you get it. You need something from the civil service, you get it, etc., etc., etc. Right? So it is a powerful post, I accept it. To be fair, I was probably the only working class guy that I knew as well in that post.
Yeah. I mean, it's
because they're all Oxford, Cambridge. At St Andrews.
I think they've recognised. I mean, you'll know better than I. There's certainly, because I've spoken to SIS individuals and others over the last few years, and there has been a massive increase in diversity because they realize how it improves their work.
Correct.
Yeah. Having access to people who have not just being able to read about it in a book or something or look online. You have somebody in your office that understands a community or a country or an issue. You improve the quality of your decision making. You improve the quality of your intelligence. You improve the work environment. The case for diversity is not just about quotas and numbers. It's about having a better service and providing a better service.
Correct. It's even deeper than that, Nazir, because in the branch we had a good friend of mine of Asian heritage, a couple of Asian heritage. We had a couple of black guys. We had an Asian heritage woman. In special branch, where in the security service and in SIS you had none. Okay, that was just the reality. So of any power, shape, or anything. So the branch, the police, if you want to use it in that term, although we were only doing political work, had people with some power in those roles because they understood that it's not just about understanding the history of the politics, whatever, it's understanding the feeling. If you're dealing with terrorism and you've never had a problem in your life that makes you think, you know what, this is worth dying for, then how can you understand it?
Yeah, exactly that. And if you don't understand how powerful radicalizers can be,
correct,
the buttons they press,
correct.
You know, and you'll know again, that to radicalize somebody, often they often put a whole army on them, online, in person, etc., and work on the most vulnerable people who are relatively easily they're able to manipulate them, but do so in such a way that it's so powerful. You don't understand that unless you have some understanding of this, how the process works.
And often the people manipulated are bright. It's not that they're not bright. We need to get away from this, because if you look at many of them, they're bright and they can see the flaws in the system and think, how am I going to change it?
Yes.
So they work through that. And you can say, this is how it gets changed, brother. This is how it gets changed, sister. And you can change it, but you'll never change it from within the system. That's what they work on. No, so it's very powerful.
And the other side of that, though, Carlton, is that to de-radicalise, we give them one coach who spends an hour a week.
Absolutely right.
I know they've spent a whole army radicalising them, and we'll give them one mentor.
Absolutely right. They spent a whole lifetime. Yeah, you're absolutely right, my friend. Superb. Absolutely right. They spent a whole lifetime because it works on the lifetime. It's from the pea bashing that they used to be, right? So that's just your beginning, and that's working through from hearing your father, your mother, your uncle say this is what was happening to us, and then you come to the perspective now. I'm third generation, whatever. This is why I like to talk about us not just being here now. I like to talk about people of colour being in this country in the Roman times, because otherwise we're never going to say it's ours. When do we say it's
exactly? They were well accepting, weren't they, of people of colour going back 2,000 years? I mean,
correct.
You think about the Muslims, the Moors, and the Ottoman Empire, and you think about the 700, 800 AD, the impact it had back then. You're absolutely right. If we just focus on what's happened since 1958 or since Windrush or something, we're actually missing a trick here.
Correct.
Going back to the point about history, we have to learn it ourselves so we can have a proper conversation with people.
Yes.
But at the moment, all we get from the media is, they all arrived in 1951.
I mean, just on that one, I always enjoy saying, they all joined in 1940 on the Windrush. And I always love saying that if you listen to the BBC commentator on that, because they speak to a guy called Lord Kitchener, I don't know if you've heard of him, he was a big Calypso guy. So mine's heritage, Caribbean heritage. And he was a big Calypso guy. He's the number one guy in Calypso in Trinidad. And he comes on that ship, the Empire Windrush, and basically they speak to him and they say, can you give us a song? So he sings a song, famous song about London is a place for us. He sings that song. And then the commentator says, yes, you're all ex-servicemen, aren't you? Now, 75% of those people on that Empire Windrush, which was before previously a German troop carrier, were being taken back to the Caribbean, having been servicemen, having been in the RAF, having been in the Navy, having been in the Army. And what happens is when they get back, particularly to Jamaica, there was no work. So the British then said, we can have you back if you can work in Britain. And in fact, funnily enough, the guy who put a lot of this forward was Enoch Powell, to bring these people back to work because they needed it rebuilding. So these were servicemen. These had been fighting in the war. Yeah. These weren't polkas just turned up in the Windrush after the war. But all you ever get is after the war they did this. No, sorry, my friend. In the war, these people were doing that.
We've got to educate ourselves, haven't we? Because you know that, I know that. Sadly, most people from our backgrounds and heritage don't know our own history, and so it's easily we often get manipulated. I'll be honest with you. What pisses me off a lot is that there are some people of colour who actually bought into this mantra. Yes. Now, we're all new. We've only been here 6 years. Where are we? We're a burden on the state. We come here to take all their jobs and all their benefits. Well, which is it? Are we claiming benefits, or are we doing their jobs?
Exactly.
Literally, we've got to ensure that we can have those conversations in order to stop those far rights, for example, becoming radicalized into thinking that we're the enemy.
But it is about, you see, the thing is that the history's there. 1777, I'll just give you a very last one. American War of Independence. And basically what the British said is, if we win the war and you fight for us, you enslaved Africans. Example, it's just Africans, but there's also, the Lascars came around that time as well, which I think, if you win the war, we will bring you back to Britain. Well, actually, they lost the war against the Americans, as you know. They put them in Canada. And in Canada, they stayed, but they had very poor land. And some stayed in Canada, but some, up to about 10,000, said, no, you promised us Britain. And it was a woman actually who fought for it, a black woman. You promised us Britain. So the Royal Navy said, OK, and it transported round about the figures, people don't know 100%, to Britain. And this was one of the many, many movements into Britain for people of colour. But anyway, at that stage, and if you look at the etchings of people like Hogarth, you'll see them, Black Bob and various other people there in all these etchings. Right. So in the 1780s, they had a thing called 1784, 1785. They had a thing called the Poor Black Relief, which is why they tried to create Sierra Leone. And the poor white, they said there's not a town, a village, or a settlement where you can't go and see these people, i.e. blacks he's talking about. But the poor order of woman seems to like them within their loin, right? And they steal our houses, jobs and women. Now, that was said at that time. Before, in 1601, Queen Elizabeth I made the same proclamation saying they're stealing our houses, jobs and women, ship them back and give the job to a Dutchman to ship out a lot of then they called us Moors, ship out a lot of the Moors out of Britain. So what I'm saying is, people have been here forever and a day, and they know it. So why is that history not transmuted? We have to.
Power thing, isn't it? You lose power if you tell people that they were here because we called them to be here. They want to, going back to the point we earlier on. It's very good to divide and rule, isn't it? So let's create this image and perception, and of course the media buys into it because that's all. They're very fickle, and they'll just report what they're told. And of course, when as we're currently having a crisis, you look for the people to blame, and it's easy to blame the extra numbers that have arrived because they're using our gas and electricity without thinking. Actually, unless
they're Ukrainian,
we only have gas and electricity because of them. Because they actually built the stuff that enables this to happen. It really, as I said, we need to educate ourselves. We need to have this conversation, not just with ourselves. You made the point earlier about allies. We need to have the conversation in those challenging places. And sometimes it's not very welcome, but you need to go into those working men's clubs and environments, quite frankly, where you might not necessarily be welcome or think you're welcome, and have a conversation. And before you know it, you will find, and I've come across this, and you will have through your work, some of the most extreme people become the people that you can work with, because they get what the reality was. They understand that they were radicalized. They understand what happened to them, and they become you're able to work with them to have the most challenging conversations with the most challenging people.
Yes, and I think a lot of the right wing, oftentimes, see, the right wing's problem is this: it basically takes in the history, the perspective that's been passed through to them. It's an easy win. Yeah. 2 million here, 2 million unemployed, get rid of them, we've got all full employment. That's how the right wing works. And many of them who are followers, I'm not talking now the people who are creators, but the followers, they have basically drunk that Kool-Aid, as the Americans say. Yeah. And I think once you talk with them, this is why there should be no such thing as no platforms and all this sort of nonsense they talk about. It should be discussion. The only reason people ask for no platforms is that people don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
Once you know what you're talking about, I want the platform. I'll talk with any right winger because I'll tear him up. Because I'll tell him that Emperor Septimus Severus was an African and ran Legianus Africanus here in Britain in 210 AD, was buried in York, taken back later to Rome.
You don't need to go that far back. You've got to think about what we add, the value that we add now, the roads that you drive.
No, but the point with Severus is this, my friend. The point with Severus is this. This is before the Angles and Saxons.
Yeah, no, I totally understand that, but I think with your average person, just explain to them that the National Health Service, for example, would completely, utterly
can't function. Exactly.
A quarter of doctors and nurses are from minorities.
Yeah.
Right now, because of the shortage of staff in social care, the government are pleading with the Philippines and other parts of the world, please send us your trained carers.
Correct. Because they got rid of the Europeans.
Services that we're reliant upon in this country would utterly and totally collapse. So when you talk about, get them out of the country, etc., think about the consequences. Britain only yesterday went from being the 5th biggest economy to the 6th biggest economy because India has now become the 5th. That must really piss off a lot of people. But the point is that Britain has enormous potential, and it needs to rely upon not just the usual suspects. It needs to find the potential of people of colour. And there are now so many of us in education, in professional world, in business and enterprise. We just need to be given the opportunities that we lack. And I look at my children, and they are all in their 20s, and they are people just like yours, I imagine, and others, who are determined to make a difference to the country, the only country they know.
To their country.
Yeah. Absolutely,
that's the big point. That's the big point that we want to make here, to their country. And to me, who's had a little bit of a different upbringing in terms of our family, was taken in by many people who were white, and therefore I have no problem and never have had in associating. I've had my fights, of course I have, every day, and every day there was going to be a fight. But the bottom line is that I know it is, and that's why also I'm happy to say that the whole of Britain was institutionally racist. Not just the police. That's a sort, and that's a working class sort, by the way. You see, what we need to understand in Britain is that the working class has been fooled, and I don't want to make this some sort of Marxist thing because I'm not one, but has been fooled for so many years that an elite, and let's choose a different one, an elite has lived well off telling them that there's a problem, and that happens everywhere. So I think people need to understand that, and that's the message that I try and bring out through this show.
100%. I mean, they want against that divide and rule thing. They want the working class to working class need to recognise that. I'm sure they do. You often hear this one about white working class boys are the people who do least well in education. Which is absolutely spot on. It's 100% true. But what it doesn't tell you is that they still will get better jobs.
Correct.
Than black
Exactly.
people.
Exactly.
So the racism or the classism eventually unwinds when it comes to white people. Because black women and black girls have it worse than anybody else. And I think
But do better, though. But do better.
They do better, absolutely. But
do better.
In terms of education. So we have to recognise that it's much more complex, but they would want to divide working class against middle class, black against white, South Asian against black, African Caribbean. There is an enormous, Europeans, those Romanians over there. How many times have you heard them trying to create another enemy?
Absolutely.
But because they would rather us be divided rather than thinking we are British, we want to contribute as much as we possibly can to the country of our home, the country where our children have made their lives and will make their lives, and the opportunities that we've been given, and we'll make the most of them. And I think, it's a crying shame that we are where we are in terms of the division that people are trying to manufacture, and the culture war being part of that, to suggest somehow that we're on a different page. We're all on the same page, and Britain will only succeed when it ensures that all of its citizens have the same opportunity.
Absolutely, we have to be on the same page. And I would add one more thing, that racism isn't a one-way street. So what I will say is, and we know there's different defining elements, but within practically every country that I've ever been to, and I've been to 3/4 of the world, there is racism. I don't care whether that's in India, whether that's in Pakistan, whether that's in Israel, or whether that's in I don't know, Sri Lanka, or in South Sudan. Wherever you want to go to, you're going to find racism. So it is a factor everywhere. We just
but again, it's a relatively new phenomenon. I mean, historically, a couple of hundred years ago, it wasn't seen that way. And,
correct, it wasn't.
It's been created by powerful people that want to divide people.
Correct.
Correct. If you really want to go through history, as you will know, humanity started in Africa.
Correct.
Jesus wasn't white. So all of these things have been manufactured over the last 200 years or so to create this image that somehow one race is better than another race.
Correct. And as I said, race is a nonsense. So there we go. But now let's get to you, my friend, because you are, and you won't know this, but we've already spent 41 minutes just talking about where we were, and I want to get to you. So tell me how you moved from that chap, originally speaking Punjabi, Pashtun. Okay.
From Northwest.
Okay.
I wanted to become a lawyer, despite the fact that my family didn't think it was appropriate because they didn't.
Why?
Well, most immigrants had a concept that they might be kicked out. So we want you to be a doctor or an engineer. Something that would be useful back home, as my parents thought, because if we're kicked out. So I persuaded them, look at Gandhi was a lawyer, Jinnah was a lawyer, Nelson Mandela was a lawyer. Actually, lawyers are forces for change.
Correct.
So that, at the end of that was, I think, the convincing argument. I qualified as a lawyer, and then initially I wanted to do some defence work.
Can I ask you how difficult that was? Because you're running over it as though it's easy. How difficult was it to qualify? Because then there was very few people.
Well, there were hardly any. I had no role models. The only, I can't think of any role models at all. So it was difficult, but again, I had some. I enjoyed study. I'm one of those. Back then, I was much more likely to be found in a library than a nightclub, and. And so I focused on that, and that was the only way I could get through it, really. But I also began to understand what I said a moment ago about the fact that law is a force of change and a way to bring change, a tool for enabling change. So again, I didn't experience racism at university other than people who were not students being racist. But once I'd got through that, I went to Guildford Law School. Again, I think I'm looking back now, it was in the late 80s. I don't remember another non-white face in my class. But again, nobody made me feel different. So I'm not going to say that.
Oh, why should you? This is real. It's reality.
Very much so. And then when I went back to Birmingham to do defence work, I enjoyed it for a little while. I turned up at police stations and giving advice to suspects. But then after a while, I realised that I didn't like the people I was giving advice to. And so then I became aware of the fact that the Prosecution Service had been created. And I thought, actually, this is more interesting to me. Building.
What year was that again?
So it was 1990 for me, and the CPS was created in 1986.
Correct. Police and Criminal Evidence Act.
So, and it also meant that I could leave Birmingham and go to London. So I ended up in London, in central London, in Victoria, where CPS headquarters offices were at that time. I was literally walking past the old Scotland Yard, or the new Scotland Yard, it was old.
New old Scotland Yard, yeah.
In the days before high security, so we're talking about 1991, 92. So I was able to just walk in and talk to senior officers in the organised crime team and others, because there was a real lot of suspicion. There was suspicion because, as you appreciate, police officers didn't have an independent gatekeeper.
Correct.
Yes, existed.
Correct. No more
and they didn't like that. So
absolutely
for me, I'd just pop in between court and going back to the office. I'd pop in and I'd see a senior officer in whichever division, and I'd say to them, "Have you got anything that I can help you with?" And that, I think, became a bit of a shock because they weren't expecting that. I thought, actually, you're on the same side. Yes, we are. We're on the same side. We want to build strong cases. We don't want you to waste time on cases that are not going to go anywhere, but we want to help you identify what obstacles you need to face, legal obstacles, and how you can overcome them. And so within a short space of time, I became first contact for the organised crime team at the yard, first contact for the paedophile unit, in the late 90s now. And extraordinarily, I was doing cases way beyond my pay grade because we didn't have KPIs back then, key performance indicators. So Nazir could go to court and do whatever he wanted and work on the cases that...
But you were still working on the 60-40 though, weren't you?
Yeah, pretty well. We didn't have a figure like that. But you use your gut. Is it more likely than not? So how can you work out 60-40? I mean, it's impossible. Here's 3 statements saying he did it, 2 statements, but, that doesn't happen, does it? So you apply your judgment, but, there was I think we were more risk averse back then, actually.
That's what I was going to say to you, because I from CID colleagues, and I didn't have to spend a lot of time with them because I was in the branch, but from they used to say we now can't get anything through.
Yeah, that's
so
true.
Is that true? Would you think that was true?
Well, I think that's to do with resources, isn't it? It's not just the culture has changed in the sense that if you've got fewer prosecutors, then they've all got, 100 cases each, live cases. Well, you don't want 110 live cases, So they raise the threshold in some way to enable some cases that would otherwise go through. But back in the 90s, late 90s and in the Blair years, we weren't short of funds. So we were properly able to resource these cases. We had enough lawyers and admin staff and paralegals. And very quickly, Carlton, 2001, I became the first assistant chief from a Muslim background. And this was 3 months after 9/11. Which says something about the organisation at that time. Rather than thinking, you can imagine what it was like. All Muslims were suspected of being involved in Al Qaeda back then. And then 3 months later, the DPP appoints me as the assistant chief for London, which must have caused some ructions. But actually, I felt.
But I could see how they would also see the positives in that.
I see the positives.
So I would see how they would see the positives, because at that time I was writing papers about the future of the Asian community in Britain. Example. Yeah. And the fact that what you needed to do now was not fall to the backlash, because that was a big danger, fall to the backlash. So I can see.
It's one of the wonders of this country, but that's what they did, and I felt a real sense of not loyalty is too strong a word, but I felt I need to now. I've been trusted. It was a massive role. I'm going to make the most of it. And one of the things that we were really bad at back then, Carlton, is public engagement. The statute that created the CPS said independence, and the people within the CPS assumed that meant detachment.
Right, okay.
We're in the same room as you. You might influence our decision making. Actually, you and I can be in the same room but have completely different views. So I started going out into the community and talking to the public of West London and North and South London as well, and trying to understand your concerns. Why are you concerned about the way crime is developing, or what crimes are we not prosecuting? What could we do a bit better? And that's I think what I brought to the role, which nobody else had at that time. And it meant that I went back and we were able to develop first policies on antisocial behaviour, first policies on honor-based abuse, first policies on all manner of crime and activities. Hate crime is another example, and that was because they were properly informed by the people who were most impacted. But it was literally, again, this is maybe a cultural thing. I work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. My family know. I mean, when I left the CPS in 2015, I had more than 100 days of leave to take. I literally didn't take leave. I enjoyed my work so much, or felt a real sense of duty that I would work weekends, I would work evenings, and I would go, when you engage with the public, you can't say, well, we'll engage with you between 9 and 5. You've got to, they will work. So you got.
Can I ask you to explain, because this is where people don't understand. It's like, I know you now do work with the police and crime commissioners. It's like people assume that when they say this, a police and crime commissioner. In fact, the media now just calls people commissioners. So people then assume that they're police. Example. When they're not, they're totally nothing to do with police.
Ex-police,
maybe ex-police, but they're not. But they're not police. Exactly. I mean, and people assume that. So this is with the CPS. This is what I just want to say. With the CPS, under the, I worked for the Germans before, and they had a thing called the Staatsanwalt. Okay, so the Staatsanwalt is basically like the CPS, and he has all people. But you can't function without him because he's a bit like, as I know the French have, an investigative magistrate. So. He's a bit like that, but he doesn't do the investigation. The police do the investigation, but they control the whole of the investigation of the police, where you don't in Britain. So what I want you to explain is how it actually works in Britain.
Well, I mean, now, we'll talk about now because people aren't interested in how historically where we are. So there's something called the Code for Crown Prosecutors, which is a published annual document placed before Parliament every April, and that determines how the prosecutors will work. In essence, there's two things. Two issues. One is the evidence. Is there enough evidence? Is there a realistic prospect of conviction in relation to a case? And that evidence gathering or the evidence weighing up is not a scientific exercise. The point is that I said earlier on, it's not about how many witnesses there are, 3 in favour, 2 against. You look at the weight of the evidence. You look at whether it's coherent, clear, etc. So obviously, digital evidence and CCTV evidence can be more powerful, that kind of thing. So you look at the evidence, and if you pass that test, the second one, which is probably the least understood, is what's called the public interest test. Is it in the public interest to prosecute somebody? Because in this country, since the 50s, it's not been the case that every time somebody has committed a crime or when there's evidence they've done so, that they should be prosecuted. You have to weigh up their youth, weigh up vulnerabilities they may have, weigh up whether the crime is serious. Obviously, the more serious the crime, the more likely it is you will prosecute. You never, ever not prosecute a murder or a rape or whatever it is on public interest grounds. You might do so on evidential grounds. That's a different story. But the public interest test is perhaps the least understood, but at the end of the day, it's that judgment about, and again, everything that the prosecutor will take account of is recorded in the Code for Crown Prosecutors. So I would ask your listeners to just go online to look at the Code for Crown Prosecutors 2022 edition, and they will see the factors that the prosecutor takes account of. And as I said, the likelihood is the more serious the crime, the more likely it is to be prosecuted. And evidence isn't a scientific exercise, and it's often the relationship with the police is really strong. So police officers don't just come and here's the evidence, have a look at it. They work from a very early stage, often pre-suspect.
Well, right now they don't even charge until
often pre-suspect. Exactly. There's no suspect. Often pre-crime. We think there might be crime coming soon. We need your help as to what evidence do we need to collect to prevent this from happening, or to deal with them when we knock on their doors. And so there's a really strong relationship which wasn't there obviously when in the beginning service was created, but now has been established.
So do you think it's moving towards directive like it is in the European systems? Because the European systems, and indeed the American system,
Scotland, Carlton, as the Procurator Fiscal has been going through
Scotland, correct? Yeah.
Yes. So I personally think it should. To be honest,
you think it should?
I think there is we're still working a bit of silos, and with resources being as tight as they are, going to be tighter. We should be working much closer together. Poor officer, and the level of experience of officers has diminished, as you will know.
Correct.
When people talk about 21,000 officers going,
joke.
What they don't understand is that's 500,000 years of experience that's gone. Yeah.
And also that's 40,000 officers who've left. So you're only covering the figure. Yeah.
So the levels of experience will take us several years to get up to the level where we just have them. And so there needs to be closer working together, whether you call it directed or not. I think the reality is that the relationship now is that, police officers will go to prosecutors early and ensure that they are involved in the evidence collection stage and not just simply in the evidence.
Right. So the problem with that then, Nazir, and this is where we get into tough talk, because the problem with that then is that the Crown Prosecutor is responsible for the case, for much of the case's element, but the police take all the hits. That's where we are today. The police take all the hits. I've never heard of a Crown Prosecutor taking any hit for any case not going to court. And I give you the example of Lawrence to tell you to kick you off.
I'll give you the case on which I'm most famous, the Rochdale grooming gang cases or grooming gang cases. I prosecuted those cases when other prosecutors had chosen not to.
There you go.
I went on publicly and said, we got this wrong. Thankfully, I put it right, but we got this wrong. I wouldn't obviously name the prosecutors because they,
But that's not what stuck, is it? What stuck is the police were lazy. The police didn't do their job. The police saw them coming out of housing. The police saw this. The police saw that. The police are frightened of prosecuting Pakistani males. That's what people say.
Numbers game, Carlton. There's 120,000 police officers and there's 5,000 prosecutors.
Exactly.
So it's a numbers game. So and policing, has been around a lot longer. So therefore, that's why policing takes the hit.
But whilst you have that position, Nazir, and I'd just like to come back at me, whilst you have that position, what it means is that you sit in a nice siloed perspective and take none of the hits, whereas now you find it difficult maybe to recruit. And I've heard this quite recently. I was talking to somebody who's in the police service saying, I don't know if I'd ever go into CID because there's too many hits on it.
Well, CID, detectives they can't recruit for DID.
Exactly, because
people don't want that role. There's no.
Don't want it. There's no advantage.
And you're literally in the firing line all the time.
Exactly.
Look, this is where I think if the prosecutor is directed,
then they take the hit.
Then they would take the hit.
Then they take the hit.
But that requires a legal decision, actually, not a political decision. So, but I personally would be in favour of it. So I've got no issue with that. I think it's absolutely right that the people who are ultimately responsible for the case are literally responsible for the case, and not just Johnny or Jimmy or Jenny prosecutor, police officer. So I think it's really important that we work together and that responsibility is had. But I don't want to talk about mistakes. We should be building strong cases together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But you see, as you know, the commissioner's just got fired. Yeah. I'm not a fan. I'll tell you that straight up. Right? No. I'm not a fan, never was. But the commissioner's got fired. The reality is she should not have got fired. That's the reality of it. Okay? But she's got because a Crown Prosecutor, a Chief Prosecutor at her level would not have got fired for what she did.
You'd be
right? And the problem is with the police, they're getting fired for everything. Look, the fact that some lunatic cousins murders somebody, 1 out of 120,000, and you say, right, the commissioner, this is terrible, the police should know better than that. When I give you a prime example of it, you had a doctor who killed 120 people. Right? You know that up in your area, Manchester. Right? Yeah. Okay. So this guy kills 120 people. Nobody turned around and said, "Don't trust doctors." Now, what the commissioner did, this is why I'm no fan of hers at all. I'm going to tell you that. But she turns around and starts saying, "Oh well, if a bus goes past, run to the bus driver and ask him for assistance."
Yeah.
This is ridiculous. But that's the pressure they're under.
I mean, I've spoken about the former commissioner quite a lot. I've written about her. If you look on the Mail, it wasn't just cousins, though, was it? I mean,
there were the factors.
There was the culture is created by a leader, and the perception of and the policing cannot operate in 4 years' time. In 2029, policing is 200 years old in this country. So we've got an opportunity. Policing is always built on public confidence. If the public, for whatever reason, don't have confidence in you, then you have to go. It's as simple as that.
I think that's.
We've lost that in the last week.
We're great. This is great because we're coming on a different angle. Because I don't think that's true. Look, every country, and I told you I've been to 3/4 of countries in the world, polices by consent. I can't really think of one that doesn't. So that's from China to bloody wherever. I can't think, because if they didn't, they couldn't control the masses. It's as simple as that. You can't control the masses. So there's an element of consent. Many are much more consented than they are in Britain. So I can think of the Austrians whom I worked with and did some talks for them, are much more within the people with their policia locale, or in the case of gendarmerie, or in Spain actually policia locale, and various other places. So you get very tight relationships with the public. So that's a given. But if you tell the public the police are no good 9 times out of 10, you keep telling them that, that's what you will get. So what I'm saying is, what we don't understand about the British system also of policing is that the power of policing in Britain does not sit in the hands of the commissioner or chief constable. It sits actually in the hands of every individual officer, because all the powers, you know this, you're a lawyer, all the powers basically say a constable may, a constable shall, a constable, and I tell you, if a constable, this is the way they are, or used to be, they may be a bit less now, if you as an inspector or you as a superintendent or whatever say arrest that man, if that constable hadn't seen and said, well, you do it, I didn't see anything wrong. Because that's where the power sits. Because he or she has got to answer for her actions. So they are the most powerful police, one of the most powerful police in the world, the British police. Because we have things like Section 3, whereby you can turn around and say, I assumed, I suspected an offence was committed, and I suspect this fellow has committed the offence. Now, you can't do that in France. Only inspector judiciaire can do that type of thing. So British policing at the lowest level of constable is extremely powerful. So all they do is they go out and they carry out their acts. Now, yes, you can set tactical, strategic overviews, but tactically it's run from the ground. That's British policing. Whether that's right or wrong,
absolutely. But if you can't see a police officer because there isn't anyone,
that's true. The numbers are down.
You're more likely to see, and this is not a joke, you're more likely to see a cardboard cutout of a police officer in a shop. You've seen them. Somebody said to me the other day, if you're being burgled, ring Uber Eats. They're more likely to turn up.
It's true. It's true.
So it's not. Nobody's attacking policing. What I've always said is that we need to resource it. You can't do stuff on the cheap, and you can't expect people to maintain morale and to be confident in doing their jobs if they're just not visible. Back in the day when there was a street crime initiative 20-odd years ago, I remember vividly, some chief constables decided to spend all that extra money not on new bobbies but on new cars. And you had these new cars whizzing through streets of London, for example, and the public just did not. They lost the connection,
I think crime has changed. I'm a criminologist, so I'll give you my background. I'm a criminologist. Crime has changed. You're not going to get anywhere walking the streets. But you have to target.
You were in intelligence, Carl.
Correct. Correct.
To prevent stuff, you need to have the intelligence, and
Correct.
To build relationships, you need to build strong relationships with your communities.
Correct.
And I think this is where we've lost that connection.
We do.
We don't blame policing here. 800 fewer police stations, 600 fewer magistrates' courts. 21,000 fewer police officers, 24,000 fewer civilian staff. Policing has taken a massive hit.
But what the uniform guys say. The uniform guys say, who used to be in the borough policing groups, or before that, I think they had, for my knowledge, what was the guy? What was he called? They used to have a team of about 3 or 5 in police stations. And what these guys used to do, used to go and sit down with the old lady around the street and sit down with her and have a drink of tea and find out what was going on, and she'd tell them everything that's going on. And that was where their intelligence source was coming. It's basic intelligence what they were having, but it is intelligence. It was basic. It's not secret intelligence. It's just basic stuff. So that's what they were getting, and they were sitting with these people, having a drink, coming across the road, doing this, that, and the other. And within that, they'd get good cases, and they'd put them together, and then they could target individuals. That's not happening now.
No, it's not.
That's not happening now.
And of course, the crimes that people are concerned about, burglaries, ridiculously low detection rates, rape and sexual offences, ridiculously low conviction rates and prosecution rates.
Can I ask you about that? Can I ask you why is it ridiculously low? Because I've got my ideas why it is ridiculously low.
Well, there's all sorts of reasons. I mean, again, it's not largely down to resources again, because you used to have well-resourced. In 2015, it's only 7 years ago, by the way, we had the highest conviction rate for sexual offences in our history. Right? So 7 years ago, we had you had specialists in London. You had Sapphire teams. You had specialist sexual offence teams. You worked closely with sexual offence prosecutors who were properly resourced to do so. The NGOs, the ISVAs and IDVAs, the people who provide support to victims, were well resourced. Every agency, the courts didn't wait. You can wait 2-3 years for a trial now. You get a trial in 2-3 months back then. Everything was.
No, but that's still not hitting on the conviction rate. You see, what I'm talking about the conviction rate is when you put it in front of a court. When you put it in front of a court, yes, and the court says.
Obviously, I mean, there's a very long conversation we can have about juries but myths and stereotypes. You know, and I know that juries go into a room and there'll be one person in that room thinking, actually, I never believe anybody that would ever be raped. There must have been.
I don't think it's just that. I don't want to be negative on anybody, male or female, because both can get raped and anything on that. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is now we've set a bar of, our bar is dead simple, beyond all reasonable doubt. Yeah. And the truth of the matter is, if you really prosecute to beyond all reasonable doubt in front of a jury, you probably can't get any case through. Because beyond all reasonable doubt is extremely high, and it should be. But how do you get that through without massive amounts of evidence? So they watch TV programs that say we've got all this forensics, we've got all that, we've got all the other, and when that's not on show in the court, they go back to say, well, in CSI they have all that, so maybe there's no case to answer.
I agree with you on that. I mean, it's the CSI effect, isn't it? The number of times, where's the DNA from the breath in the room?
Exactly.
They're asking for stuff, but that's bad advocacy. The advocates should be able to explain to a jury, that's not real life. This is real life. And we do get convictions. So, clearly we get it right some of the time. We just don't get it right enough of the time. And I think, the point is that we were good at this just 7-8 years ago. We just need to go back to the sort of multi-agency approach that was being taken. And we've fallen backwards. And, of course, that has massively damaged confidence. You've got women now who think that rape has been decriminalised. And I'm not going to disagree with them. You've got people thinking, well, burglary is no longer a problem anymore for policing. So I'm not safe in my own home. There's all sorts of confidence issues that we're having to deal with, and it comes back down to resourcing. We need the levels of experience and policing that we've had. We need the levels of experience of prosecuting. We need our court backlogs reduced from the ridiculous levels they are, and there were these bad levels before COVID. So don't you dare anybody suggest to me that COVID's made it a tiny bit worse, but they were always in existence before COVID, and as a system, it's broken. So there's no getting away.
It's absolutely, you don't get any argument from me on that. Look, the biggest problem, and it's not just policing, it's not just Crown Prosecution, it's the whole system. What they've done is they have taken basic roles, basic jobs that they see as basic. I'm talking now the ruling elite, our government. Yeah. What they say as basic jobs, and they've basically said anybody can do them. So they've continued pushing down on the capacity to pay people in these roles. Take nursing, take teaching, take policing, take whatever. They've been pushing down, no 0% pay rise, etc., pushing down. Then, on top of that, taking away the perspective that you had, because I listened very clearly to what you were saying. And what you were saying in the beginning is you didn't see it as a job, you saw it as a calling.
It's a mission.
That's what a lot of police officers saw it as. That's what a lot of nurses saw it as. That's what a lot of teachers see it as. Now they've taken that away. So now it's just a role.
Yeah. No, Carlton, I'm with you. Well, you and I are both on the same page. We decided to go into justice, in policing and justice, because we wanted to make a difference.
Correct.
We did make a difference. The point is that people are much younger than I now and are not able to do so because the system has breaks them and has broken itself. So, I despair sometimes at where we are at. But I know what works. We know what works because it did work. We just need some people in power to grasp this and think this is not just a numbers game. You need the Carltons of this world back in the job, doing the job. Not that you may want to, but
I wouldn't touch your barge, Paul.
All that experience is sitting there waiting. And they some of them would happily come back. But not just cold case stuff. They want to be able to share their experience and bring their experience to those, to do the amazing jobs they've always done.
Well, I've got to say thank you very much, Nazir. What an interesting episode. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been listening to, and we only touched upon you, actually. If I could get you back sometime in the future, would you agree to?
Absolutely.
Absolutely fantastic. And when we'll go a bit more through your life rather than the bigger picture. Cool. Well, fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Nazir. Hopefully you will come again in the future, as you said you would. And ladies and gentlemen, we will speak to you again next week.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for free.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
More than a quarter of a century, I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.